welcome to our deep dive into essentialism. You guys sent in some awesome excerpts from Greg McKeown's book, and we're excited to really break it down and pull out those golden nuggets for you.
It's such a cool approach because he's not saying do less just to do less.
Right.
It's all about being really intentional about where you put your energy and your time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. He defines essentialism as the disciplined pursuit of less. So it's not just about doing less, it's about doing less but better.
Exactly.
It's focusing on those vital few things rather than the many trivial things that can just kind of clutter up our lives. Have you ever felt pulled in a million different directions and just
All the time.
struggling to prioritize?
Oh, yeah. I think that's something we can all relate to, especially with all the demands of today's world.
For sure, for sure. McKeown gives a really great example to illustrate that concept of less but better. He talks about Dieter Rams, the designer behind that iconic Braun record player, the one with the clear plastic cover.
Yeah.
I love that record player. Just so different from all those big clunky cabinets that were the norm back then.
Totally. And that's exactly the point. Rams just stripped away everything that wasn't essential and focused on that one core function, just playing those records.
Yeah.
And his design was so successful, so impactful, that it even influenced a whole generation of designers. It's a perfect example of how focusing on the essence of something can lead to really innovative and impactful results.
That record player makes essentialism seem like a lot more tangible,
Really?
McKeown also shares this personal story that I think really contrasts the essentialist and non-essentialist mindset. You remember the one where he goes to a client meeting while his wife is in the hospital after giving birth?
Oh, yeah, that one really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Even though he knew deep down that he should be with his family, he still felt this pressure to attend that meeting because of work commitments. It's the perfect illustration of how we get caught up in non-essential things, even when our gut's telling us otherwise.
Right, yeah. We almost default to saying yes, even when we want to and probably should say no.
Yeah.
That default yes is something I struggle with too. But essentialism encourages us to recognize that we actually have a choice in those moments.
It's true.
McKeown says how society often rewards us for saying yes and almost punishes us for saying no.
Totally. It's almost like busyness has become like a badge of honor these days. Slowing down or taking time for yourself is seen as slacking off.
Yeah, like you're not doing enough. McKeown talks about this difference in thinking as the non-essentialist who feels like they have to do everything versus the essentialist who recognizes, oh, I actually choose to do this.
Oh, interesting.
It seems like a lot of it hinges on that subtle shift in perspective.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about, taking back our power to choose how we spend our time and energy. It's about moving from feeling like a victim of circumstance to becoming the conscious architect of our own lives.
Yeah.
And part of reclaiming that power is understanding how success can actually distract us from making our highest contribution.
Okay, yeah.
That's what McKeown calls the paradox of success.
Oh, interesting. So how does this paradox play out?
Well, he says it happens in 4 phases. It starts with achieving some kind of success, right? Which then leads to a bunch more options and opportunities coming your way. Sounds good so far, right?
Yeah, sounds pretty good.
But then in phase 3, you start to feel really stretched thin, trying to keep up with all these demands.
Yeah.
And then eventually in phase 4, you become so scattered that you end up distracted from, the very things that would allow you to make your most meaningful contributions.
Interesting.
Think about it. Have you ever achieved something like a success that actually created more stress and distraction than it was worth?
Mm-hmm.
That's the paradox in action.
Whoa, that really hits home. It makes me wonder how many of us are stuck in that cycle without even realizing it.
Right.
So essentialism offers a way to kind of break free from that, right? To recognize that power of choice. But how do we even begin to identify what's truly essential? What's the starting point?
Well, that's where this principle known as the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle, comes in.
Okay.
It basically states that 80% of our results come from just 20% of our efforts.
Oh, okay.
The key for essentialists is to figure out which 20% of their activities are actually generating the most impactful results.
Gotcha.
Think about your work, just this past week. Were there a few tasks that really moved the needle, that yielded those significant results?
Okay, yeah.
That's your 20%.
I'm starting to see how this applies to everyday life. McKeown uses the example of Warren Buffett. He's known for making very few investments, but choosing them really carefully for maximum impact.
Yeah, exactly. He's not trying to like dabble in every opportunity that comes his way.
Right.
And that focus on those vital few, that often requires us to confront another challenging reality, which is this concept of trade-offs.
Trade-offs.
Yeah. McKeown stresses that saying yes to one opportunity means saying no to countless others.
It's almost like there's a hidden cost to saying yes, right? It means you're automatically saying no to something else, whether you realize it or not.
That's such a good point. We see this playing out in the business world all the time. McKeown uses the example of Southwest Airlines. They built a super successful business by focusing on being that low-cost airline. But that's required them to make some very specific choices, like only offering point-to-point flights and not serving meals on board.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah. And those trade-offs have really paid off for them. Like they've consistently outperformed their competitors who are trying to like be everything to everyone.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
remember Continental Airlines? They tried to copy Southwest's low-cost model while still trying to maintain their existing business model. And it just created a ton of internal conflict and ultimately led to huge financial losses. It just goes to show you how important it is to be willing to make those intentional trade-offs. It's like trying to straddle two different worlds, and you just end up falling in the middle.
Yeah.
So it's not just about recognizing the power of choice. It's about recognizing the power of saying no to make space for those things that really matter, even if it means disappointing some people along the way.
Exactly. And that's true for personal commitments as well. Like remember that example of the parents who strategically helped their son get into Harvard. They were super focused on like a few key activities where he could really excel, and then they helped him uncommit from anything that wasn't contributing to those goals.
Yeah.
That laser focus, that's what helped him stand out.
That's such a good example of how this applies to like everyday life. It almost makes me want to step back and look at all my commitments and be like, okay, what do I need to like edit out of my life to make space for what's truly essential? So how do you think people can create that space in a practical way? Like, where do they even begin?
Well, McKeown talks about think weeks, which he was inspired by Bill Gates, who takes a week off twice a year, completely disconnected, to simply read and think.
Wow.
Yeah. But obviously, most of us can't just disappear for a week. But, even incorporating a mini version of that into our daily lives can make a difference.
Okay.
Just, carving out even 20 minutes to read something thought-provoking, something outside your usual, information bubble, can create that space for reflection.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it can help you connect with what's important. Have you
Yeah.
ever tried something like that?
Actually, I recently started a new habit of spending 20 minutes before bed reading classic literature. It's been surprisingly relaxing and helps me wind down.
That's great. Creating those pockets of space, even if they're small, can make such a big difference. And on that note, McHugh is like a big advocate for journaling, just to gain clarity about what really matters. He suggests keeping it small and manageable, like write less than you feel like.
That's interesting. I've tried journaling before, but I always felt like I had to write pages and pages to make it count,
Right.
Like a smaller, more focused approach feels a lot more doable. Do you keep a journal?
I do. It's not really about recording everything that happens,
Right.
It's more about capturing those key insights and reflections that emerge throughout the day. It's like you're taking notes on like the story of your own life.
That's a cool way to think about it. But I gotta admit, sometimes just finding the time and energy to focus on anything feels impossible, especially when I'm like sleep deprived.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to another crucial aspect of essentialism, which is prioritizing sleep.
Hmm.
Remember Jeff, the guy, like the overachiever, who ended up with those serious health issues because he constantly pushed himself to the point of exhaustion.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that, you can't pour from an empty cup. Sleep is not a luxury. It's essential for our physical and mental well-being.
And for our ability to do our best work. McKeown also mentions a study of violinists that found the top performers were the ones who actually prioritized sleep.
Wow.
It wasn't about just practicing more. It was about practicing with focus and clarity, which required being well rested.
That's really interesting. I think so many of us have this idea that sleep is for the weak, that we should be like grinding 24/7 to achieve success. But the research is clear. Sleep is a key asset, not a weakness. It's an investment in our ability to make our highest contribution. Have you ever noticed how much harder it is to focus and make good decisions when you're tired?
Oh my gosh, yes. It's like night and day, the difference in my productivity and creativity when I'm well rested versus running on fumes. But in a world that's like constantly connected and demanding our attention, prioritizing sleep can be a real struggle.
It's true. We can definitely explore that tension further. But first, I think it's important to connect this whole sleep conversation back to the idea of editing our lives. Remember how McKeown compares our lives to a film that needs to be carefully edited for maximum impact?
Yeah, I love that analogy. He talks about how there's strong correlation between Academy Awards for Best Picture and Best Film Editing. It really highlights how important editing is for telling a compelling and impactful story.
Exactly. Just like a skilled film editor removes those unnecessary scenes to create, a really tight and engaging story, we need to be willing to edit our own lives. And that might mean letting go of commitments, projects, or even possessions that are no longer serving our essential goals.
It makes me think about all the non-essentials I'm holding on to, both like physically and metaphorically. It can be hard to let go, especially when we've already invested, a lot of time or energy, maybe even money into something.
Totally. And that's where we run into what's known as sunk cost bias. It's that tendency to keep investing in something even when we know it's not working, just because we've already invested so much.
That reminds me of McKeown's example of the Concorde jet. It was an incredible feat of engineering, but it was a financial disaster.
Oh, yeah.
Yet the governments involved just kept pouring money into it, even when it was clear it wasn't commercially viable.
It's a classic example of sunk cost bias playing out on a grand scale. But we see it in our own lives, too. Maybe it's sticking with a project that's clearly going nowhere, or maybe holding on to a relationship that's just not serving us anymore.
And it can be so hard to break free, especially when we're emotionally invested. I remember that story McKeown told about the guy who spent his life savings trying to win an Xbox at a carnival game.
Hmm.
Like he was so determined to recoup his losses that he just kept playing, even though it was clearly a losing proposition. It's a pretty extreme example, but it shows how sunk cost bias can affect anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. We can all get caught up in that, clinging to the familiar even when it's no longer serving us. But essentialism, it encourages us to be more discerning, to ask ourselves, if I weren't already invested in this, would I invest in it now? It's a powerful question that can help us break free from, that grip of the past and make more objective decisions about our present and future.
Wow, that's a great question. And it applies to things before you even commit to. It forces you to think, is this really in line with my goals? Or am I just saying yes out of habit or obligation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good place to, to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground here, from defining essentialism to, the power of choice, the importance of sleep, and the challenges of overcoming sunk cost bias.
Mm.
What's really stood out to you so far?
The idea of editing our lives, both literally and figuratively,
Yeah.
it makes me want to look at all my commitments and think, what can I let go of to make more space for the things that truly matter?
I love that. And remember, it's a process, not a destination. We can just approach it one step at a time. Start with those small changes that feel manageable and then build from there.
Okay, that's encouraging. It feels less overwhelming when you think about it as a series of small steps rather than one massive overhaul.
Exactly.
I'm excited to see where this exploration of essentialism leads us next.
So we were talking about editing our lives, but that can feel kind of daunting, right? Where do you even start?
Oh, yeah, it can be super overwhelming, especially when you think about all the areas where you might need to make changes. Like your physical space, your schedule, your commitments, all that stuff.
Totally. And I think one area where this really comes into play is the information we consume. Just think about it. We're bombarded with information constantly all day long, from news and social media to emails and notifications. It's like a never-ending assault on our attention.
Oh my gosh, it's true. I often feel like I'm just drowning in information overload,
Yeah.
It's exhausting just trying to keep up with it all, let alone actually processing it and making sense of it all.
Right. And McKeown argues that we need to be way more discerning about the information we let into our lives. He talks about becoming like a journalist of your own life,
Mm.
which basically means actively seeking out information that's actually relevant to your essential goals and filtering out all that noise that distracts you from what matters. It's think of it this way. If you were a journalist writing a story about your life, what information would be essential to include? And what could you leave out without sacrificing the core narrative?
That's a great analogy. It helps me to think about it more strategically. Instead of just passively consuming whatever comes my way, I can be more intentional about what I read, watch, and listen to.
Exactly. It's all about asking yourself, does this information actually help me to understand what matters most? If the answer is no, then it's probably best to just move on.
Hmm.
McKeown actually tells this really interesting story about the Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crash.
Oh, yeah.
Investigators found that the plane was in perfect working condition, but the crew became so fixated on this minor issue with the landing gear indicator light that they completely lost sight of the bigger picture, their altitude.
Wow, that's a pretty sobering example of how losing sight of the essential can have some really serious consequences. It's a reminder that we need to regularly check in with our overall goals and priorities to make sure we're not getting lost in the weeds.
Exactly. It's like getting caught up in the details and forgetting to look up at the stars. You know, we need to have systems in place to regularly zoom out and reassess our direction. Like, are we still on course? Are we still focusing on the things that matter most? And if not, how can we course correct?
So how do we get better at being those journalists of our own lives? Like, how can we filter out the noise and focus on the signal?
Well, one really powerful strategy McKeown suggests is journaling. And I'm not talking about like writing pages and pages every day. Even just a few minutes of focused reflection can be incredibly powerful. It's about capturing those key insights and observations that pop up throughout the day. It's like you're taking notes on the story of your life. You know? Do you find journaling to be helpful?
I've tried it on and off, but I always felt this pressure to make it into this big elaborate thing. But maybe if I approach it as just a way to capture those aha moments and those key insights that come up during the day, it might feel less overwhelming.
I think that's a great approach. And remember, the real power of journaling comes from actually going back and reviewing those entries periodically, maybe every 90 days or so, just to look for those patterns and insights. It's like you're sifting for gold, you know? You're
Yeah.
trying to find the signal in all the noise. You're trying to understand what's truly important to you and what might be causing you unnecessary stress.
Hmm. That makes sense. It's not just about capturing information. It's about making sense of it and using it to actually inform our choices and our actions moving forward. It's like doing research for the next chapter of our lives. Speaking of moving forward, once we start to get clearer on what we want to edit out of our lives, we also need to start thinking about what we want to edit in, right? Like, how do we start to define those essential goals and priorities?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
McKeown talks about the importance of crafting an essential intent.
Mm.
It's basically a clear and concise statement that captures the essence of what you're trying to achieve.
Mm.
It's like a compass that helps you stay on track, especially when you're faced with those tough decisions.
It sounds like having that kind of guiding statement could be so helpful, especially in those moments when you feel pulled in a million different directions. Do you have any examples of what an essential intent might look like?
Yeah, McKeown uses the example of Brad Pitt's organization Make It, right, which was founded with the essential intent, to build 150 affordable, green, storm-resistant homes for families living in the lower Ninth Ward.
Wow, that's a great example. It's specific, it's measurable, and it's impactful. You can see how that statement could guide every decision and action they take. It almost feels like once you have that clarity of purpose, the non-essential things just naturally start to fall away.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's like a filter that helps you to sift through all the noise and really zero in on what truly matters. And it's something that we can all strive for in our own lives, whether it's related to our work, our relationships, our health, or any other area that's important to us.
Yeah, it's a really powerful concept. And it makes me think about the difference between trying to do everything versus choosing to focus on those vital few things that will actually make a difference.
That is a key distinction.
Mm.
And it leads us to, that challenging but super essential art of saying no. Once you have that clear understanding of your essential intent, you can start saying no to commitments and opportunities that just don't align with your goals.
Mm.
Of course, that's usually a lot easier said than done. You know,
Ah.
it can be really hard to say no, especially when we're worried about disappointing others or, maybe feeling like we're missing out on something. Have you ever struggled with that?
Oh, totally. I think most of us have this natural tendency to want to please people and to avoid conflict. But I'm realizing that saying yes to everything is actually a form of self-sabotage. It prevents us from doing our best work and from making our highest contribution to the things that truly matter.
That's such a good point. And McKeown really emphasizes that saying no is not about being selfish. It's about being selective. It's about choosing to focus on those vital few opportunities that will have the biggest impact and letting go of the rest.
I love that. That reminds me of the example he gives of Mark Adams, the managing director of Vitso. It's a furniture company that's basically offered only one product for decades, the 606 Universal Shelving System. They have this super rigorous selection process for everything they do, from hiring new employees to choosing which projects to take on.
Oh, yeah, they're a great example of a company that has embraced that power of no.
Mhm.
They've chosen to focus on what they do best and to resist that temptation to chase every shiny object that comes along.
It's almost counterintuitive, right?
Yeah,
But their focus on less has actually allowed them to achieve more.
it's the paradox of essentialism. And it's
Yeah.
not just about saying no to new opportunities. It's also about uncommitting from existing commitments that are no longer serving us.
Oh, yeah, that can be even harder, especially when we feel obligated to see things through, even when they're clearly not working.
It's that sunk cost bias we talked about earlier. We tell ourselves we can't quit now because we've already invested so much time or energy or money.
Hmm.
But McKeown reminds us that it's okay to change our minds, to walk away from something that's no longer serving us.
Yeah, it's like admitting we made a mistake, which can be tough to do, but it's often the most courageous and essential choice we can make.
It's about freeing ourselves from the past so that we can create a better future. And sometimes that means letting go of things that we once thought were really important, but that just don't align with our goals anymore.
So, how do we actually start to uncommit from those non essential commitments? Like, it feels like there's so much fear and guilt that comes up when we even think about doing that.
Well, McKeown has some really practical advice on how to navigate that process.
Mhm.
First, he suggests asking yourself that powerful question. If I weren't already invested in this, how much would I invest in it now?
Hmm.
It helps to cut through that emotional baggage and just see things a little more objectively.
That is a powerful question. It really forces you to evaluate whether something is truly aligned with your values and your goals, or if you're just clinging to it out of habit or inertia.
Right? And once you've made the decision to uncommit, McKeown suggests being really clear and respectful in your communication. It's not about being rude or dismissive. It's about honoring your own needs and priorities.
Yeah, he even talks about like crafting social contracts with colleagues or using humor to kind of soften the blow.
Yeah.
It's about finding ways to decline opportunities without damaging relationships or burning bridges.
That's a really important point. Uncommitting gracefully is about recognizing that your time and energy are valuable resources that you need to protect. And it's also about respecting the time and energy of others.
Yeah, this conversation is making me realize that uncommitting isn't a sign of weakness, it's actually a sign of strength. It's about having the courage to make choices that are truly aligned with your values and goals, even when it's hard.
That's such a great way to put it. It's about taking ownership of your life and making conscious decisions about how you want to spend your precious time and energy.
And once you've kind of cleared the clutter and created space for the essential what's next, how do you actually start to execute on those essential goals?
That's where the power of routine comes in. McKeown explains how routines can help us to conserve our mental energy and make it easier to get things done without having to constantly make decisions about what to do next.
It's like putting those non essentials on autopilot so we can free up our minds for the essential.
Exactly. And he explains how routines actually work on a neurological level, strengthening those neural pathways through repetition. Remember the example of Michael Phelps. His pre-race routine was so ingrained that it freed up his mental space to focus on, the task at hand.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example. It shows how routines can help us to overcome procrastination and just achieve that peak performance.
And the beauty of routines is that they don't have to be super complicated or rigid. They can be as simple or as elaborate as you need them to be. The key is to find what works for you and to be consistent.
So, how do we create routines that actually work for us? I've tried to establish routines in the past, but they never seem to stick.
Well, McKeown suggests starting small, focusing on one habit at a time. You know,
Mm.
it's about setting realistic expectations and being patient with yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Trying to overhaul your entire life all at once is definitely a recipe for overwhelm and burnout.
Totally. And he also emphasizes the importance of identifying your triggers, like those cues that prompt you to engage in those certain behaviors.
Hmm. That reminds me of Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit. He explains how every habit is made up of a cue, a routine, and a reward.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cue is basically the trigger that tells our brain to go into automatic mode. The routine is the behavior itself, and then the reward is what reinforces the habit.
So if we want to change a habit, we need to identify the cue and then create a new routine that will lead to a more desirable reward. For example, if the cue is like feeling stressed instead of reaching for a sugary snack, maybe the new routine could be going for a walk or listening to some calming music.
Exactly. And McKeown suggests, a bunch of strategies for creating new routines, like setting clear intentions, creating visual reminders, rewarding your progress, And I think it's really important to remember that changing habits takes time and effort. We need to be patient with ourselves and we need to be persistent.
Yeah, it's a journey, not a destination, right?
Absolutely. And the rewards are totally worth it. When we create routines that support our essential goals, we make it so much easier to live a life of less but better.
It's like we're setting ourselves up for success by creating an environment that actually supports those essential choices.
That's a great way to put it. And I think this leads us to like the final piece of the essentialist puzzle, being present in the moment.
Ooh, that sounds like a great topic to explore. It's
Mhm.
something I personally struggle with a lot. My mind is always racing, either dwelling on the past or worrying about the future.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common experience.
Yeah.
But McKeown argues that being present is essential for living a truly fulfilling life. He talks about the importance of focusing on the now, letting go of those past regrets and future anxieties.
That sounds amazing in theory, but how do we actually do that? It feels like our minds are wired to constantly jump between the past, present, and future.
It's definitely a skill that takes practice, but McKeown offers some really helpful strategies. One is to simply ask yourself, what's important now?
It's such a simple question, but it can be so grounding. It really helps to shift our attention away from that endless stream of thoughts and to-dos and just bring us back to the present moment.
Exactly. And he also talks about the difference between chronos time, which is that quantitative chronological time, and kairos time, which
Hmm.
is more qualitative and opportune.
I'm not familiar with those terms. Can you explain them a little more?
Sure. So chronos time is like clock time.
Uh,
It's about those minutes and hours ticking by kairos. Time, on the other hand, is about recognizing the right time for action, the opportune moment. It's about being sensitive to the nuances of a situation and responding accordingly.
okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about managing our time effectively. It's also about being aware of the quality of our time and using it wisely.
Exactly. And McKeon suggests, a bunch of other strategies for being more present, like getting the future out of your head by writing down your to-do list or scheduling time for play.
Play, that sounds fun. But how does play fit into the whole essentialist philosophy?
Well, McKeown argues that play is essential for creativity, exploration, and just overall well-being. You know, it's about engaging in activities that bring you joy and allow you to tap into that sense of wonder.
So it's not just about working hard and being productive. It's also about taking time to recharge and to reconnect with ourselves.
Exactly. Play helps us to escape those pressures of our daily lives and to approach our work with renewed energy and enthusiasm.
It's like giving our minds a break from all the doing and allowing them to just be.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it's an important reminder that essentialism isn't just about achieving more. It's about living a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance between striving for excellence and embracing joy.
Exactly. It's about creating a life that's both meaningful and fulfilling. A life that reflects your values and allows you to make your highest contribution to the world.
That idea of making a contribution brings us back to the example that McKeown uses to really highlight the core of essentialism. Remember his discussion of Mahatma Gandhi?
Oh, absolutely. Gandhi's life is like a truly remarkable example of intentional living.
He was all about simplifying, right? Like focusing on what truly mattered. He even, famously reduced himself to zero, got rid of possessions, distractions, all of that, so he could just pour all his energy into his mission.
He even went like 3 years without reading any newspapers. He said they were just filled with non-essential information, just distracting him from his purpose.
It's wild to think about all the things he intentionally didn't do. That level of commitment is, wow, it's inspiring. It just shows you how powerful it can be to cut out the noise and focus. Of course, we don't all have to go to those extremes, but we can definitely learn from that. Even small changes, right? Just to reduce the clutter can make a huge difference.
Totally. It's all about making those conscious choices and asking ourselves, is this the best use of my time right now? Is this essential?
It's a powerful question. But sometimes the answer might lead us to do things that seem, I don't know, counterintuitive, like saying no to something that sounds like a good opportunity.
Right.
McKeown talks about how we're often punished for good behavior, like saying no, and rewarded for bad behavior, like saying yes to everything. It's almost like society has it backward.
Yeah, it's true. It explains why so many of us feel this pressure to overcommit and spread ourselves so thin.
Yeah.
Like busyness is a badge of honor, and slowing down means you're not doing enough. But essentialism challenges that.
It reminds us that saying no isn't selfish. It's about protecting our time and energy so we can do our best work, Be the best version of ourselves, not just the busiest.
And realizing we can't do it all. There are always trade-offs, like You can't say yes to everything, so you have to be picky about where you focus your energy.
Like, we're the editors of our own lives, choosing which scenes make the final cut. We have to be willing to cut some scenes, even good ones, to make sure the whole story is tight, impactful. Has this approach been helpful for you in your own life?
Oh, yeah, totally. Embracing those trade-offs has been huge for me. It helps me be more intentional about how I spend my time and focus on the projects and relationships that really matter. And it helped me let go of that guilt I used to feel when I said no to things.
It's freeing, right? Knowing you have the power to choose. And that freedom lets you be more present and engaged in what matters. It's like that saying, wherever you are, be all there.
Yes, exactly. Essentialism is about being present in each moment, not letting your mind run off in a million directions.
And remembering that our time is limited, we only have so many hours in the day, so many days in a year, we need to make them count.
It's not about like dwelling on death or anything, but it's about embracing life, living each day to the fullest by focusing on what matters.
McKeown's friend, who visits cemeteries when he travels, well, it's a bit morbid, but it's an effective reminder, wouldn't you say?
It definitely makes you think. It's a reminder that we all have a limited time here, and we should use it wisely.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into essentialism, what's the key takeaway you hope our listeners will, walk away with?
I hope they remember they have the power to choose. You can choose to be reactive, letting the world dictate your priorities, or you can choose to be proactive, consciously designing a life that reflects your values, a life that lets you make your greatest contribution.
Living a life of less but better, a life of meaning, purpose, and joy.
And it starts with a simple question. If you could only focus on one thing for the next year, something that would truly make a difference, what would it be?
That is a great question for us all to consider, and I think it's the perfect place to leave it. Keep diving deep, everyone. And remember, less but better.